Hi, I'm Dave Cross. Welcome to this class on using Photoshop and Lightroom together. In this class, I'm going to be looking at some ways where you can create graphic elements in Photoshop that we're going to use in Lightroom. So it's a little bit different than the first class that I taught in the summit on Photoshop and Lightroom, because that one was really addressing which one to use in different circumstances. Should I use Photoshop? Should I use Lightroom? And spoiler alert, if you didn't watch that class already, the answer was probably both. And then I spent some time talking about how to move files back and forth. So how to create a two-way editing street, if you will, between Lightroom and Photoshop. Now in this class, we're going to do a little bit different because we're really creating graphic elements and saving them and then using them in some interesting ways in Lightroom, including at least one way that I think is a little bit different than we might expect. And then in the second half of the class, I'll talk about a really interesting way, if you do tethered shooting, how you can take advantage of creating a Photoshop graphic element and using it almost like a live preview inside of Lightroom when you're doing tether shooting. But first of all, we're going to talk about something called an identity plate. That's something that you have the ability to put in the top corner of Lightroom. So I'm talking about right here where it defaults and says Lightroom Classic, and you'll see my name is there. That's because I have previously gone in here. On the Mac, it's under the Lightroom Classic menu. I believe in Windows it's under Edit, and we go to Identity Plate Setup. And you have the choice between just having it say Lightroom Classic and your Adobe ID. And then you can also personalize it. Now, before we do that, let's talk about why you might want to do that, because having your name in the top corner rather than it saying Adobe Lightroom, the main reasons people do that is a couple of reasons. If you're doing any kind of demonstration of the software, certainly it's not a bad idea to have your name there. But I think more so a lot of people use Lightroom as a sales tool. So as they're working with clients, they show them all the photographs and then kind of go through to show their pics and things like that. So having your branding in the top corner is not a bad idea. And as we'll see, it's not just there that it appears, it can be used in some other places as well. So here we have the ability to just make it look the way we want. So you can pick different fonts. This one is the one that's being used by the main module picker buttons. And you can have this say whatever you want. And you can be more specific about it. Say I want this to be bold and I want this to be a different color. So maybe a lighter gray, for example. And whatever you do here in this editor, you'll see that right away it updates at the top corner here. And then you have options of adjusting these too if you wanted to, which I can't imagine we do too much, but I'll show you at least one aspect of that later. But the other option, which is interesting, it says right here, it says use a graphical identity plate. So this allows us to actually load in a graphic and use it. Well, of course, that means we have to have a graphic, which is where Photoshop comes in. So I'm going to use this graphic as an example, a logo of a fictitious photographer, and we want to create that identity plate that's going to appear there. So we're going to make a new document in Photoshop. So even if you don't use Photoshop very much, this aspect is relatively simple to do, depending on how complicated you want to make it, of course. And we're going to make the width a maximum of 360 pixels. I think you can probably do a little more, but that's a pretty good reference as to the maximum width. And for height, technically, the height can be up to 42, but that's going to make your graphic go right up against the edges of the other elements in Lightroom. So I'm going to suggest we probably want to do a height of 40 pixels, and then we hit Create. And depending on your monitor resolution in Photoshop, it could end up looking pretty small, but that's okay. We're going to zoom in a little bit so we can see what we're doing here. And I'm going to take elements from this other graphic that I have already. So for example, I want to take the initials and the words, but I'm going to do them separately because I'm not going to be able to use it exactly the same as it is here. So first of all, I'll take the layer called initials. I'm just going to use a command that's considered drag and drop, which allows me to bring the initial layer over. It's way too big, so I'm going to go to Edit and free transform. You can see I get these handles here. If you didn't see those, by the way, you could, once you picked free transform, choose fit on screen, and then it'll scale down to see the handles. I'm going to hold down the Option key on the Mac, Alt for Windows, so I can scale to center, and I want to make it just small enough so that I can see the entire graphic. And then come back to my other document and take this other layer, which by the way is not an actual type layer in Photoshop, it's just some words. And that's because when this logo was created, we wanted to make sure that we didn't have to worry about people having the right fonts installed. So now I can drag the words over, do the same thing, drag and drop them down, Command or Control T for free transform, Command or Control 0 for fit on screen, and then Option to scale down. Hit Enter, and I can use the arrow keys to nudge. I think actually now that I do this, I'm going to nudge it all the way over here because this was originally created with those initials in the middle. So I think that's probably going to be a better look, and let's drag that layer on top. So all we're doing in Photoshop here is we've got the background layer, which is really just going to be there to help us see what we're doing. And then I've got the words that say the photographer's name and then the initials in color. So a couple things I need to do to prepare for this. If we think about the way Lightroom looks, it's on a black background. So I could, I suppose, keep this white background, but then I'd have like looking like a, I don't know, a white piece of tape there. I don't think I really want that. So I'm going to hide the background layer and ultimately want to save this as a PNG file. But the problem is right now the type is black. So if we do that, then of course that means, well, we're going to have black type on a black background. With the words layer, I have to go click on the words layer to make sure it's the active layer, and then press Command I on the Mac, Control I for Windows, which is invert. It's going to mean it's a little hard to see here, but that's okay. If you wanted to, you could, while you're working, turn on the background layer and invert it to black, and then that's going to give you a preview of what it's going to look like. But just got to remember to turn that off. Now, in theory, you could leave the black background on and save the file, and then when you bring it in, it's going to match up with the black, it's going to match up with the black part of Lightroom. But part of my plan here is there are other ways I want to use this identity plate beyond just the top corner of the software program. So it's better to turn off that background layer and save it as a transparent PNG file. So I turn that off. We're going to go to File, Save As, and call it JK Logo 1. And pick PNG, and I'm going to save it somewhere where I can find it. Hit save and then OK. Now back to Lightroom. Still have that identity plate editor up here, so I'm going to click and choose Use Graphic Identity Plate. When you do that, it's going to ask you to locate your file. Now it happens that I had previously grabbed a file from this folder. The first time you're going to have to identify where to grab the graphics from. And I would suggest it's not a bad idea to do this, to create a folder somewhere that you're going to put all these graphic elements you're going to use in Lightroom, so then it will keep defaulting back to this folder. So now I'm going to pick this first one, choose it, and you can see, look at that, looks pretty nice. There's our nice identity plate in the top corner. And if I really wanted to, I don't think I would, but if you wanted to try and make it look all cool and everything, you could go to this side for the modular picker buttons and say, I would like to choose a color which is kind of similar to the color part of my logo. Now you see, ooh, look at that, nifty menus. No, I don't think I want to do that. Let's not do that. But you could if you wanted to. Now this will stay this way until you change it again. But here's the thing, if you want to be able to switch in and out of this and sometimes show your logo and other times not, then you're gonna wanna do one other step, and that is in here, we wanna save this as my logo. So that way, if you decide to go back to just the text, but then you wanna go back to the logo, you just choose it instead of having to do that whole thing of loading it and everything else. So we're going to leave it as that for now. So remember we said one of the reasons for using that transparent background PNG was because of using the identity plate in other places. Here's what I'm talking about when I refer to that. I'm going to go take one of these photos and go to the print module. And if I wanted to print this and have my logo on here, one of the options that you'll see in the print settings is identity plate. And you can see why in this case it looks much better to not have that white box around it. However, there's one little problem, and that is, what if you were wanting to print this as a display at a little booth at a vendor show or something like that, and you want this logo to be bigger? Well, in theory, you could scale it larger, but as you do, you see the quality starts to go downhill. So even though we're going to see a message that discourages us from doing this, here's what I would suggest we might want to consider doing. Assuming that you have your actual logo here, we're going to make a new document, and I want it to be 11 inches wide, 8.5 tall, and the resolution is 240 because that's what I use for printing. Hit create, and then all we're going to do is take our couple of logo elements here, drag those into this other document. And one little trick we can do, we want to make sure this is centered, if that's what we want. We go under the select menu and choose select all. And then we're going to click on each one of these and say, I want these to be centered horizontally and vertically. Deselect and then take our initials and put them exactly where we want. And once again, hide the background layer and create a PNG file of that. And in fact, what I might do if it was me, and well, today it is I might also take one where I put it down in the bottom corner and call it something so I know what it is. Also a PNG file. Hit save and OK. Now back to Lightroom. Now here's where we're going to run into a little message. If I say I want to use a different file and I want to use this large one, when I go to choose it, it's going to say this file is very large. We recommend using a smaller file. Well, I don't know 100% that this is the case, but I'm assuming it's because they're thinking, well, that's never going to fit up here in the top corner, but that's not what I want to use it for in this case. So when I click OK, you can see now, look at that, I have a much nicer, clean logo. And if I wanted to, I could lower the opacity so it was a little more subtle. Or I could also go and find that other one, which is in the bottom left. Click OK. So you can see that the point of this whole exercise is that the identity plate, most people think of it as that top left-hand corner, which is certainly the most visible place for it, but it also appears here in the print module, in the slideshow, and in the web module. So if you wanted to, not that I don't know that many people that use the web module, but if you did, you can see that one of the options is to put in the identity plate. So if you did that, I would probably take out that text. So the small one works pretty well for that. And like I said, also is available in the slideshow. Now, I did mention that if you didn't have a logo already or you didn't have it in separate layers, how would you create that initial identity plate? Well, it really just comes down to this, is building something. And it could even just be type-based. You could decide you just want to have more control because in Lightroom, you can only put one line of type. So maybe I want something that looks like this. So let's just go back to something where I can see it. Now, whenever you're putting two type layers very close together in Photoshop, it's a little easier if you initially type it somewhere else. I want this to be something much smaller, like this. Now we can take our move tool and position it wherever we want. And then the same things apply. You would hide the background layer, export as a PNG. So it doesn't have to be a graphical local. You can certainly use type to do this. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit is a watermark. Now, a watermark is something that's similar but a little different, and you can also use it in different ways in Photoshop. Typically, a watermark is used more for protection, I suppose, than branding, although it could be used for branding as well. So the process of making a branding watermark would be exactly the same as we just talked about. But let's address something different. What if you want to be able to add some other graphic element to a series of photographs? That's another place where we can use a watermark. We'll use an example of a graphic for some wedding photos. So here in Photoshop, I have downloaded a piece of stock art from Adobe Stock. And this is just showing me an example. It's done in Adobe Illustrator, but it doesn't come with the typeface. So we're going to assume that we don't even have Adobe Illustrator. So what we could do very simply is take our eyedropper and sample this color. And then I'm just going to take my polygonal lasso tool because it's pretty easy to use. Make a selection and then choose fill. I made a new layer, so this is going to be able to do this. Fill with my foreground color, make sure preserve transparency is off, and then I can deselect. Now, if I take my type tool, I want to use some kind of script type font. I think I'm going to use this one. And of course it needs to be something I can see, like white. Looks like my caps lock key was on. So I want to take this type and line center. There. Now I also want the ampersand, but I don't really like the ampersand in this particular typeface. So let's see what else we have. I think I like that one better. And then we'll just, for the sake of ease, take this type layer, hold down the Option or Alt key and drag down to make a copy. Take these three layers. Now there's a lot of things we can do to make sure it all looks good, and I think this ampersand probably needs to be a little lower down, and both layers probably could, every layer could probably stand to move over, but for now we'll just say that that is done. And I'm doing it this way so now I could customize this for different people. So now I would save this as a PSD file. When a new couple is going to come in, I would just put in their names, edit if necessary, and then at this point, same old deal. Give it a name, save as a PNG file. OK. Lightroom. But instead of using the identity plate, we're going to go instead to watermarking. And one of the things that makes this unusual is that we have more options for how we apply the watermark. So you can see that by default, it just assumes you want to enter a copyright notice, and then you can decide how big you want it to be. You can choose things like the font and the shadow, etc. Also, how big you want this way. You can do it either way. And then at the bottom here, there's the ability to anchor it. So if you want to anchor it to the top or bottom, so on. But for our purposes, we're going to not choose a text version, but a graphic one. So we're going to go and find that graphic we just created. And you can see right away, this is better because now we can choose the position. And now, in the context of our document, it's going to be the size and position that you want. Save here, it's going to save it as a preset. So you can see there we have it now in that corner. And if we look at our other images, including the ones that are not in landscape orientation, you can see how the other advantage of the watermark is it is rotated automatically. So what I've shown you so far are kind of what I would consider the standard or typical ways that people use both the identity plate and the watermark, but I want to at least open up another possibility for you. Now, realistically, if you're familiar with using layers in Photoshop, it would be better ultimately to bring a Lightroom document into Photoshop and do what I'm going to show you in there. But at least I want to show you this possibility exists because it might get your minds thinking of some creative ways you could take advantage of this. So what I'm going to do here is make a new document. And again, I just wanted, actually it's already set up 8.5 by 11, hit create. And what I ultimately want to do is I want to create an effect here so that when I bring this into Lightroom, it adds what looks like an interesting border effect right in Lightroom. So normally, as I said, what I would do is bring the Lightroom file into Photoshop and then do it in here. And I'll show you that briefly in a moment. But just to show you a possibility, I have a document here. This is actually, I created this myself. I took a dry paintbrush and painted a bunch of stuff and then scanned it in. So I'm going to take this and drag and drop it on top of my page, and then I can scale it to the size that I want and the position, something like that. Now what I want to do is I want to make whatever is black a hole in the middle of our white page. And the simplest way, I mean there's various ways to do it, but I'm going to suggest for our purposes, so I can show you quickly, the simplest way is to select all and copy. I can hide this. Then go to our background layer and add a layer mask. I want to paste what I copied onto the mask. And the only way I can do that is I have to view the mask in Photoshop. So I hold down Option on the Mac, Alt for PC, and click right on that layer mask thumbnail so that I'm actually viewing the mask. I know you can't see the difference, but look at over here, you can see that little outline around the mask. And now it pastes on the mask, and I can use my move tool and just kind of nudge it down here to the position I want, and then deselect. Now, if I once again Option click on the mask, you can see now I have transparency in the middle, which of course, from what we've seen so far, allows me to save as, give it some name as a PNG. Now, back in Lightroom, let's pick a different file just so you can look at something different. How about this one? And I don't want that watermark. So let's see which way is going to work. Sometimes I find that the watermark will work, and other times it's going to be the identity plate. So we're going to choose this big scan border. And I had to scale it up, so now I want to use this inset to make it come down a little bit. So now I could print this and I would get this interesting border effect. So let's, just for comparison, see what it looks like if I use the identity plate, recognizing that it's going to tell me this is too big, because we know by now that's what it's going to do. Use anyways. Click OK. So in this case, that one actually worked better because it was positioned well. Now, as I mentioned, realistically, this would be better off to do in Photoshop because you have more control. But at least if you wanted to maybe even show someone, hey, here's a possibility of something I can create for you. That's part of the idea of me showing you this, is also to get your minds thinking of the possibilities. Now, there is one other option you could also use for this, and that is if you go to export the file. If we dig down a little bit, eventually you can see that we do have the option of adding a watermark as we export as a JPEG. I'll just overwrite that. And here's the file that was created. Now, it's not an editable file, so we can't adjust it in any way. So like I said, for the full control, what would I'd be better off doing is using one of the methods that we have, such as edit in Photoshop. I'm going to use this method, assuming that all my raw editing is already the way I want. So there it is there. So now I can take this document, or this layer I should say, drag it over. And normally you don't want to scale things up in Photoshop, but since this is a pixel-based image that's going to have some unusual edges anyways, and now I would do the same kind of thing. Select all, copy, hide this, go to this layer, add our layer mask, Option or Alt click, paste. You can see the mask is the wrong way around, so I just have to press Command and Control I for invert. And then if I wanted to, I would add a new layer, drag it below, and fill it with white. And the reason why it has a bit of advantage to do it in Photoshop, it gives me a little more control. So for example, I could reposition the photograph a little bit, and plus I could do further editing if I felt, now that I look at it, I don't really want there to be certain areas that have black. I can go in here and say, for example, paint these white so I have a nicer area in the middle. But like I said, the main reason for showing you the idea of bringing in something like a border effect is just to make you realize that there's plenty more options available than strictly your name or a logo, with both the identity plate and the watermark. So next, I'm going to show you how I can do a tethered shoot. So I'll go in a little bit of detail of how the tethered shoot is set up, but take advantage of a Photoshop created graphic element so I can get a live preview of how my photograph would eventually look when combined with that graphic element. In this segment, I'm going to show you how you can take a graphic element that you've created in Photoshop and use it during a tethered shoot to get a live preview of how the photo will eventually look like when it's combined with that graphic element. So I'm going to do like a cookbook cover where I have text and graphics, and I want to have a photo in there. So I want to make sure that when I'm taking the photograph of the photo, everything is aligned the way I want and looks the way I want. So I'm going to do that as a tethered shoot. And one of the advantages of tethered shooting, especially with software from Tether tools, is you can get a live preview so you can position things accordingly, and then in Lightroom take advantage of this overlay option that allows you to have the graphic showing and the photograph in context. So before I do that, I'm going to give you a quick tour. I went outside and set up a shooting area and took some quick video to show you this setup during the lighter daylight hours, because I think I'm going to probably do my photo shoot a little later in the day. So let's take a look at the setup I'm going to use thanks to equipment I have from Tether Tools. So here's my setup. You can see here's where the food photo is actually going to be taken eventually. And you'll see I have my laptop on a stand, a Tether Tools stand. This is going to give me the opportunity to have it very close to my camera. You see the orange familiar Tether Tools cable. And I have constant lighting from Westcott so that I can adjust that if necessary. One of the things I particularly like about this setup using the software called Smart Shooter 4 is it has a live view options. You can see there I'm showing, yes, it's actually live, so I can adjust things before I take the photos. One of the parts of the Tether Tools kit I wanted to highlight, I think this is a really brilliant idea, is in the past you would put the cable in and they had a little device to stop it from being pulled out, but I always felt like there was still a potential of being yanked out by accident. But now they have this thing called the tether block, and it's for ARCA, any kind of ARCA tripod mount, and you actually run the cable through it and then attach it to the camera, as you can see on my camera, and it's about as solid as it could possibly be. Well, it's later in the day, so the lighting is better for my photo shoot, but you still may hear the chirping of the birds or the barking of the dogs. That's what happens when you film outside your house. But this is going to be better for what I want to do. Now, it is possible to do a tether directly into Lightroom without anything else, but the only problem for what I want to do here, I really would love to have a live view so I can see what I'm doing, so I can move things around on the fly, in particular when I add in the graphic element. And unfortunately, in Lightroom, with certain camera brands, including Nikon and Sony, you cannot do a live shoot when you're doing tethered shooting. So I'm using this software, Smart Shooter 4, from Tether Tools, and one of the many things it does, it allows you to do a live shoot so you can see things on the fly. So I'm going to first do a few test shots to make sure I've got things set up the way I want, and then we'll incorporate the graphic element. And the falling of the trees, right on cue. So here's the live view, and you can see it really is live, so I can position things as I want and then do a test shoot. And in Lightroom, I've already gone ahead and set up the tethered shoot. So what we're seeing here is whatever the Smart Shooter software did, it's acting as a plug-in to Lightroom. And so it's very easy to set that up. Now, right now it doesn't look like much because I haven't got all the elements that I want, but I just want to first test my lighting a little bit. It looks pretty good for what I want to do. I think I may come back here and just increase the ISO and see what that looks like. That's a little more what I had in mind. Now, let's jump to Photoshop for a second, because in Photoshop, I've created an overlay. I'm going to do, this is my project here is for the poutine cookbook, a Canadian delicacy. So I want to bring this photograph eventually into Lightroom, but I want to make sure it looks the way I want. So you can see in Photoshop I have everything as separate layers and editable type and so on. And I previously saved this as a PNG file, so I made sure there was no background. So now in Lightroom, one of the options that I have is under the View menu, I can go down here to where it says Loop Overlay, and I could choose the image that I want. And I've already done that, so I'm just going to pick the one that I saved previously. And you'll see it brings in that file, and now I can see what my photograph looks like in the context of the actual layout of the graphic elements. So now, for example, I might just zoom out just a hair. Make sure my focus is still good. take a shot, jump back over. That's a little better. I like that. Now, one of the things I like about this a lot is that not only can I see everything in the context of the graphic, but because I have that live view ability, I can make whatever change I want. So if I need to shift things a little bit, I shifted too much, affected my ladle a little bit. That's more like it. Now, the other thing that would be possible, I won't do this quite at the moment, but because I have a layered Photoshop document, it means if I needed to, I could go and make any change to the document and then re-export it. But what I want to do here, I want to add some of this yummy gravy try and get just enough so we get some spillage. It's actually quite soothing to be doing a photo shoot with the sound of the birds in the background. I'm going to bring in my smoky effect here. It's kind of windy. Not sure how much I'm actually seeing that. Let's jump over. I feel like I probably see this better if this was a darker image. See, here's another great advantage of the live view is I can see whether I can see that fork in the background or not. So I have to do a little bit of editing. Actually not too much. You can see that just a little bit of the stick is there. So let me just do one thing here. I'm thinking that I want to darken things up a little bit. So I'm going to take my gradient tool and make it a black to transparent. Maybe a little lower. Save this as a PNG file. Now let's go back to our view, loop overlay, choose layout image. So now we have a little bit of a darker area. I think maybe the smoke might even show up a little better. Let's check it out and see. Get a bit more gravy. want to try one more thing. See, I'm going to probably ruin my composition here, but I want to try it. Love to get some stringy cheese, but everything's not so hot anymore. So now I'm back at my desk looking through the photo shoot that I did. Like this, you can see the steam in that one, but I think it'll be covered up a little bit. Well, like that one's got a bit of a gravy pour going. Oh, there's the one. I think I like that one. All right, so let's use that one in Photoshop. So I'm going to press Command or Control E to jump it over to Photoshop. So that opens up here. I'm going to take my Move tool, drag and drop it over. And oh, I kind of like the close-up look. That wasn't what I had originally intended when I was thinking of this page. I kind of like that one. I might actually keep that as an option. So what I would do is duplicate that layer and now go and free transform this one. So I press Command or Control T and then Command or Control 0 to see the handles, Option or Alt to size it down like that. And if I really wanted to be picky, I would remove that little bit of the stick that was there. So that's certainly a possibility. Now, I think there was, let me go jump back to Lightroom. I think there was another one. Maybe this one here, the smoke, the steam is a little better. So let's bring that over. I'm going to drag that one in. Now, one advantage here is that because I took them on the tripod, they're in exactly the same position, but I need to transform this one the same amount as I did the other one. So I have no idea how much I transform, but if I press Command-Shift-T or Control-Shift-T, that will transform it exactly the same amount. So now they should be lined up perfectly as they are. So now I can decide, okay, I like the steam there. So what I'm going to do on this top one is add a layer mask filled with black, then take my paintbrush, make sure white is my foreground color, and I'll just paint in. So I'm combining the two. Now remember, I kept the other one of a different size, so one of the things I can do here in Photoshop is create something called a layer comp. And I'm just going to name it full size. And then I'm going to show the other layer and make a layer comp called close up. And now that just simply means if I want to show someone or compare between the two, I don't have to go over to my layers panel and worry about showing and hiding. I just click these buttons. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, I don't have a huge amount of experience as a food photographer, unlike people like Nicole Young, who has a class particularly on that topic in the summit here. But I want to at least show you the concept of another interesting way of creating something in Photoshop that we use in Lightroom, in this case, as an overlay that then we're able to jump right back to Photoshop, having already have a good sense of how our photo is going to look out in the layout. So I hope you got a few ideas from this class. There's some ways where you can create graphic elements in Photoshop that you use in Lightroom.